What happens when a powerful judge tries to silence a defense attorney in front of the whole courtroom, only to realize the entire country is watching? The sound of the gavel cracked through the courtroom like a thunderclap. People straightened in their seats, the kind of reflex you see when power demands attention. It was a late morning inside the Lucas County Courthouse in downtown Toledo, Ohio, and most thought this was going to be just another routine suppression hearing. But what happened in those next minutes would spiral into something nobody in that room would forget. At the center of it all sat Judge Clifford Brenning, a white-haired figure who had ruled that bench for decades. His reputation wasn't built on fairness, but on control. He believed in hierarchy, his word above all else. Opposite him stood attorney Donovan Price, a black defense lawyer in his early 40s with a clean record of wins and a reputation for fighting tooth and nail for his clients. Donovan wasn't the kind to bow his head when he saw injustice, and that was exactly why the air in that courtroom felt heavier than usual. The defendant, a young man facing serious drug charges, sat quietly at the defense table. His future rested on the arguments Donovan was about to make. A handful of family members were behind him, their hands clasped together, nervous but hopeful. Across the aisle, the prosecutor shuffled papers, confident the hearing would tilt their way. When Donovan rose, he spoke with calm precision. "Your Honor, I respectfully object to the admission of this evidence. It was obtained through an unconstitutional search, and precedent clearly supports exclusion." He cited case law, line after line, his voice steady, almost surgical in its delivery. The jurors leaned in, following along, sensing the weight of his words, but Judge Brenning's expression grew sour, his lips pressed thin, eyes narrowing like he'd heard enough. "Counselor Price," Brenning interrupted sharply, "you've made your point. This court has already ruled." Donovan didn't flinch. He took a breath and spoke again, not louder but firmer. "With respect, Your Honor, the record must be clear. This ruling undermines—" The judge slammed the gavel again. "You are out of order, Mr. Price." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the clerk shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the deputies stationed near the doors. Donovan stood his ground. His voice cut through the tension, not hostile, but unwavering. "I am not out of order. I am advocating for my client's constitutional rights. That is my duty as counsel." For a second, silence swallowed the room. People held their breath, waiting for the judge to respond. Brenning leaned forward, gripping the edge of his bench with white knuckles. His voice came out low, but charged with venom. "Mr. Price, you will not lecture this court. One more word, and you'll regret it." The defendant's mother whispered from the gallery, "He's just doing his job." She clutched her son's handkerchief, her eyes fixed on Donovan like he was their last line of defense. Donovan glanced back briefly, then returned his gaze to the judge. "With respect, Your Honor, the law is bigger than this courtroom." Those words were like gasoline on open flame. Judge Brenning's face turned red, his jaw set. He leaned back in his chair and said the words that would ignite a scandal across the country. "Bailiff, take him into custody." Now the room erupted. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs as people stood. Deputies looked at each other, hesitant, unsure if they'd actually heard right. A defense attorney? Arrested in the middle of doing his job? The defendant's sister pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she pressed record. A law student interning with the prosecutor did the same. The prosecutor himself froze, papers slipping from his hand. Donovan didn't resist. He placed his hands calmly on the table, voice steady as he addressed the court. "I am being arrested for defending my client's rights. Let the record show." The deputies moved forward reluctantly, their eyes darting toward the crowd. Even they seemed uncomfortable carrying out the order. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed louder than the gavel ever could. The gallery erupted in shouts, some cursing the judge, others pleading with the deputies to stop. The defendant's mother cried out, her voice cracking, "He's innocent! He's doing nothing wrong." But Judge Brenning sat cold, unmoved, as if the chaos unfolding before him was proof of his power. What nobody in that moment realized was that the phones capturing every second of Donovan's arrest would soon leave that courtroom and ignite something far bigger than anyone hearing. But what started inside that Toledo courtroom wasn't going to stay there for long. The tension didn't settle after Donovan Price was handcuffed. If anything, it multiplied. The deputies had their hands on him, but their faces betrayed discomfort. They weren't rough, but their grip was firm enough to send the message. They had no choice. All eyes in the courtroom were fixed on the scene, a mix of disbelief and outrage simmering through the air. Donovan spoke as they pulled him toward the side of the room. His voice carried, steady but sharp. Your Honor, I have the right, no, the duty, to defend my client without fear of retaliation from this bench. The defendant, sitting just feet away, half rose from his chair before another deputy motioned for him to sit back down. His voice cracked as he shouted, "That's my lawyer!" He didn't do anything. Judge Brenning leaned forward, slamming his gavel again with such force that the wood splintered slightly at the rim. This court will not tolerate disrespect. Order will be maintained, or this courtroom will descend into chaos. But the chaos was already alive. From the gallery, voices shouted back. He was just doing his job. This is wrong. You can't silence him like that. One woman stood, her phone held high, her voice shaking but loud. Everyone record this. Let the world see what's happening. For a moment, the balance of power tilted. The judge's face burned red, veins tightening at his temples. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a black attorney who dared to push back. The arrest wasn't about law anymore. It was about control. Donovan, hands bound, locked eyes with the judge. He didn't look broken. He didn't even look scared. If anything, he looked resolved. History will remember this day, Judge. Not for me, but for what you chose to show the world. The courtroom went silent for a beat, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Even the deputies froze mid-step. Then the judge erupted. Remove him from my sight immediately. But the more Brenning barked orders, the less his authority seemed to hold. A group of jurors whispered among themselves, their eyes darting nervously toward the cameras. A clerk near the bench pressed her lips tightly together, visibly shaken. The defendant's mother clutched her son's hand and whispered loudly enough for nearby rows to hear. They're trying to silence him because of who he is, because he refuses to bow down. The deputies finally moved Donovan toward the door, their every step tracked by dozens of cameras. Some caught close-ups of his wrists in cuffs. Others focused on his calm expression, the way he held his head high despite being humiliated in front of peers, clients, and strangers. Just before he was escorted out, Donovan spoke again, not to the judge, but to the courtroom. Never be afraid to speak the truth, no matter the consequences, because silence only feeds injustice. That single line drew an eruption of applause and shouts from the gallery. The sound rang louder than the judge's gavel ever could. Judge Brenning shouted, his voice hoarse with rage, "Clear the gallery! Everyone out! This court is adjourned until order is restored." The bailiff moved to push people out, but the damage was done. The courtroom was no longer under the judge's control. It was under the world's gaze, and every angle of it was captured by phones that would upload the footage within minutes. Outside the courthouse, people who had been waiting on other cases gathered as the commotion spilled into the hall. Donovan was escorted through a crowd that shouted his name, some chanting, others filming, all aware they were witnessing something historic. And Judge Brenning? He remained seated, glaring at the emptying room. For the first time in years, the authority he clung to so fiercely felt fragile. He had expected silence after his order, obedience from every corner. Instead, he had lit a fuse. What should have been a routine hearing had morphed into a national flashpoint. The courtroom was emptying, but the story was only beginning to spread beyond those walls. But once those recordings left the courthouse, Judge Brenning's grip on the narrative would shatter. By the time Donovan Price was led through the side doors of the Lucas County Courthouse, half the gallery was already live streaming. The grainy videos weren't polished or framed perfectly, but that only made them feel more raw, more believable. One angle showed his wrists in cuffs. Another captured his calm expression as he declared, "I am being arrested for defending my client's rights." The hallway outside exploded with noise the second the deputies pushed through. Lawyers, interns, family members from other cases, and courthouse staff all stopped to see what was happening. A few muttered, "That's Price. That's Donovan Price," recognizing the attorney by name. The whispers turned into questions. "What's going on? Why is he in cuffs? He was just arguing a case, wasn't he?" The deputies didn't respond. Their steps were brisk but not aggressive, their eyes locked forward as though wishing they could vanish. They weren't used to arresting an attorney in the middle of trial proceedings, and certainly not one as respected as Donovan. Donovan didn't fight them. He walked with dignity, shoulders squared, voice steady when he turned to those following behind with cameras. "Keep filming. Let everyone see this. Justice dies in silence." Back in the courtroom, the scene hadn't calmed. Jurors whispered among themselves as they were ushered out, some shaking their heads. The defendant's family clung together, angry tears streaming down their faces. The prosecutor sat frozen, unsure how to even proceed. Judge Brenning barked orders to clear the room, his face purple with rage, but his voice was drowned out by the echo of people chanting Donovan's name as they spilled into the hallway. Downstairs, the courthouse lobby filled with murmurs. Security tried to move people back, but the crowd grew as word spread. Donovan's colleagues, tipped off by text messages, arrived just as he was being escorted through. One, a young attorney named Cheryl Lang, rushed forward. "Donovan, what did they do to you?" He managed a faint smile. "Exactly what they've always wanted to do." They just finally had the nerve in front of an audience. A deputy tugged his arm lightly. "Sir, keep moving." But the damage was already multiplying. Phones were out in every direction. The arrest was captured from stairwells, from lobby benches, from the sliding glass doors leading outside. In some angles, you could hear people shouting, "This is America! He's just doing his job." Shame on this court. The footage raced online before Donovan had even left the courthouse grounds. Within 20 minutes, clips were posted on Facebook and Twitter. TikTok videos added text overlays, defense attorney arrested for doing his job. Hashtags formed instantly. Hashtag free Donovan. Hashtag judicial abuse. Hashtag justice on trial. That night, local news in Toledo led with the story. Channel 11's evening anchor spoke with urgency. Tonight, outrage after attorney Donovan Price was arrested inside a Lucas County courtroom. Cell phone video shows Judge Clifford Brenning ordering deputies to handcuff Price after he objected to a ruling. The video has already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times online. The station cut to shaky courtroom footage, Donovan's calm voice against the backdrop of chaos. "I am being arrested for defending my client's rights." Those words were replayed again and again. By midnight, the clip had crossed over to national coverage. CNN's Don Lemon discussed it with a panel of legal analysts. MSNBC ran it on loop during their late-night hour, with the chyron reading, "Attorney arrested mid-trial, abuse of power." Donovan himself sat in a holding cell by then, stone walls closing in, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A guard passed by with curiosity in his eyes. "Price, you're all over the news." Donovan raised his head. "Good. Maybe people will start asking why." Meanwhile, in the judge's chambers upstairs, Brenning was fuming. He barked at his clerk, demanding press statements, furious at the leak of private court business. But the clerk, pale and nervous, finally looked him in the eye. "Judge, it's not private anymore. The whole country's watching." For the first time, Brenning's expression cracked. He hadn't anticipated the phones. He hadn't anticipated the internet's speed. And most of all, he hadn't anticipated how calm Donovan looked in those cuffs. A calm that made the judge look irrational by comparison. By dawn the next morning, Donovan's name was trending nationwide. Students at law schools in Michigan, Indiana, and Pennsylvania were posting clips in solidarity. Civil rights organizations shared statements condemning the arrest. And ordinary citizens, most of whom had never set foot in a courtroom, were asking themselves, if this can happen to a lawyer, what chance does anyone else have? But the wave of outrage online was only the beginning. The real consequences for Judge Brenning were waiting just around the corner. By sunrise the next day, Donovan Price's arrest wasn't just a local story anymore. It was a national flashpoint. Millions of people across the country had seen the shaky footage from inside that Toledo courtroom. It wasn't polished, it wasn't staged, and that's exactly why it hit so hard. The clip of Donovan saying, "I am being arrested for defending my client's rights," became the centerpiece. It was quoted in tweets, pasted onto memes, and replayed endlessly on TikTok. Someone slowed the video down, adding dramatic music underneath, turning it into a kind of digital rallying cry. On Instagram, influencers with no legal background reposted it, simply captioning, "This is America in 2025. By mid-morning, hashtags were everywhere. Hashtag free Donovan, hashtag justice on trial, hashtag Brenning must go. On Twitter, civil rights lawyers began weighing in. One wrote, "This is more than a bad ruling. It's a blatant attack on the right to counsel. Every lawyer in America should be outraged." Another added, "If Judge Brenning can jail a defense attorney for doing his job, what stops him from jailing you for asking the wrong question?" It wasn't just lawyers. High school students posted their reactions. Teachers in classrooms shared the clip during discussions about constitutional rights, and pastors in Sunday sermons mentioned Donovan's calm dignity under pressure. Cable news ran the story nonstop. CNN replayed the footage nearly every hour. MSNBC brought Donovan's colleagues on air, who defended his reputation as a fighter for justice. Even Fox News couldn't ignore it, though their framing was different. Was the judge maintaining order or abusing authority? Inside Donovan's law office, phones rang without pause. His assistant, overrun with calls, whispered to a reporter, "We've had clients, strangers, even other attorneys offering to help." Everyone wants to know how Donovan is holding up. He wasn't free yet. After being booked, he spent the night in county detention, but word spread quickly that he refused to post bail immediately. He told a fellow inmate, "If I walk out quietly tonight, it looks like I'm hiding. Let them see me walk out tomorrow morning, in daylight, with cameras rolling. The truth has to be visible." And that's exactly what happened. By the next day, dozens gathered outside the Lucas County Jail. Some held signs, "Stand with Donovan." Others carried printed screenshots of him in cuffs, lifted like protest banners. When he finally stepped out, released without formal charges, the crowd cheered. Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, microphones shoved in his face. A journalist from the Toledo Blade shouted the first question. "Mr. Price, how do you respond to Judge Brenning's claim that you were out of order?" Donovan stopped, looked directly into the cameras, and answered clearly, "My job is to defend my client. If defending constitutional rights is considered disorderly, then the system itself is broken." The clip aired everywhere. It wasn't fiery, it wasn't loud, it was controlled, calm, and razor sharp. That calmness gave it more power than a speech ever could. Meanwhile, pressure mounted against Judge Clifford Brenning. Calls for his resignation swelled on social media. Petitions circulated, gathering tens of thousands of signatures in hours. Law professors wrote op-eds, warning that his actions weren't just about one lawyer, but about the entire balance of power in the courtroom. One viral tweet summed it up. The courtroom is supposed to be the one place where truth has a fair chance. Yesterday, Judge Brenning tried to kill that truth, and instead he exposed himself. Late that night, CNN ran a segment comparing Brenning's order to past abuses of power in American courts. Commentators called it the clearest example in years of why judicial accountability is urgently needed. And in the middle of all that noise, Donovan Price sat at his kitchen table, his phone buzzing with messages from across the country. He looked tired, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his eyes heavy. His teenage daughter placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dad, you're everywhere right now." He sighed softly. "I didn't want this. But maybe it's not about what I want anymore." The storm online wasn't fading, it was growing, pulling in more voices, more outrage, and more scrutiny on the man who thought he could silence a lawyer with a single gavel strike. But the internet's outrage wasn't just about Donovan, it was about what was going to happen next to Judge Brenning himself. By the third day, Judge Clifford Brenning's world was collapsing in real time. He arrived at the courthouse under heavy police escort, a line of officers forming a path as protesters shouted his name with fury. Some carried signs that read, "Resign now," while others chanted Donovan Price's words back at him. Silence only feeds injustice. Inside, the usually quiet courthouse corridors had turned into a battlefield of whispers, side-eyes, and leaked statements. Clerks who once carried Brenning's files with deference now avoided eye contact. A bailiff who had served in his courtroom for over a decade quietly requested reassignment. And when he stepped into his chambers, he found a stack of printed editorials on his desk. Every major newspaper from the New York Times to the Los Angeles Times condemning his actions. The Toledo Blade headline was blunt: "Judge Brenning sparks national outrage after attorney's arrest." It wasn't just newspapers. The Ohio Judicial Conduct Commission released a statement announcing an emergency review of Brenning's behavior. They rarely move so fast, but the pressure was unlike anything they'd seen. The commission's spokesperson went on television, her voice measured but clear. "Judges are not above scrutiny. When authority is abused in plain view, accountability must follow." Brenning slammed the remote after watching that clip in his chambers, muttering under his breath, "They don't understand what I was doing. They don't see the disrespect I've endured." But even his closest allies weren't standing by him. A longtime prosecutor he'd shared lunches with distanced himself in a statement. "While I respect the judiciary, I believe Judge Brenning's response was inappropriate and damaging to public trust. That phrase, damaging to public trust, spread like wildfire. At the same time, Donovan's calm defiance became a symbol that Brenning couldn't erase. On college campuses, law students rallied, holding mock trials and reading the transcript of the exchange. At one rally in Ann Arbor, a student raised a poster of Brenning's face with bold red letters, "Accountability Now." Back in Toledo, Brenning tried to conduct business as usual, but every case that came before him was tainted by the scandal. Defendants asked for new judges, defense attorneys openly challenged his authority, and reporters filled the back row of his courtroom daily, cameras waiting for another outburst. During one hearing, when Brenning tried to move quickly past the defense objection, the lawyer at the table calmly replied, "Respectfully, Your Honor, given recent events, I would like the record to reflect my objection fully." The gallery snickered. The judge's face darkened. He slammed his gavel, but the sound no longer commanded obedience. It just sounded desperate. Behind closed doors, Brenning's phone rang nonstop. His wife urged him to step down quietly. His son, a business executive in Cincinnati, told him bluntly, "Dad, this isn't going away. You're dragging the family name through the mud." But Brenning's pride was bigger than his fear. To him, stepping down felt like admitting guilt. He muttered to his clerk one evening, "If I resign, they win. That man wins." The next morning, however, things got worse. CNN obtained leaked audio from the courthouse where Brenning could be heard ranting about Donovan Price. "He thinks he can embarrass me in my own courtroom? Not a chance. Not him. Not anyone like him." The clip hit the airwaves within hours. The phrase, "not anyone like him," was dissected across news panels. Civil rights advocates called it coded racism. By afternoon, it wasn't just a judicial scandal. It was a full-blown national controversy. Protesters doubled outside the courthouse, chanting louder, carrying banners with Donovan's face. Some painted Brenning's image with tape over his mouth, symbolizing the silence he tried to enforce. By Friday, even the Ohio Bar Association weighed in, their statement blunt. Judge Brenning's conduct has compromised the dignity of the court. Immediate suspension is under review. For a man who had ruled from the bench for over 30 years, Brenning was now staring at a future where the gavel no longer belonged to him. But while the judge's grip on power slipped away, Donovan Price's voice was only getting stronger. Donovan Price didn't ask to be a symbol. He only wanted to defend his client. But within days, he became more than an attorney. He became a voice people looked to when they thought about justice, courage, and what it means to stand firm against authority gone wrong. The morning after his release, Donovan sat down with his legal team in a modest conference room at his firm's office near the Maumee River. Reporters were camped outside, their lenses pointed at every window. His colleagues were buzzing with ideas, press conferences, interviews, op-eds, but Donovan raised his hand. "We need to be careful. This isn't about me. It's about the system. If I make it personal, they'll twist it. If we make it bigger, they can't ignore it." His words set the tone. He agreed to his first national interview on MSNBC that evening. When the cameras rolled, the host asked the obvious question. "Mr. Price, what went through your mind the moment Judge Brenning ordered your arrest?" Donovan leaned forward, his voice calm but charged with conviction. "I thought about my client sitting there, watching his lawyer taken away for doing exactly what the Constitution promises. I thought about every person who's ever walked into a courtroom and wondered if the system was already against them. And I thought, if I stay silent, then I prove the judge right." That was never an option. Clips from the interview spread online like wildfire. His words weren't theatrical. They were measured, but they struck deep. People quoted him at rallies, wrote his lines on posters, and shared them with captions like, "This is the voice we need right now." Soon after, Donovan was invited onto podcasts, radio shows, and panels. On NPR, he explained, "A courtroom is supposed to be where the powerless can challenge the powerful. If a judge can silence a lawyer, what does that mean for the defendant? What does that mean for every citizen who depends on that system to protect them?" Even people outside the legal community connected with him. Teachers used his story in civics lessons. Churches referenced his calm dignity during sermons. At one high school in Detroit, a teacher asked students to write essays on whether Donovan Price represented the spirit of the Constitution. Meanwhile, Donovan kept showing up to court for his other clients, walking past crowds chanting his name. Some days, protesters lined the steps of the courthouse, applauding him as he walked in. One woman held out a handwritten note that read, Because of you, my son wants to be a lawyer. Donovan smiled, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his briefcase. He didn't see himself as a hero, but he understood what was happening. People needed someone to rally behind, and somehow he had become that figure. His message stayed consistent. In every appearance, he reminded people that this wasn't about him. It was about accountability. "I'm just one lawyer," he told a CNN host. "There are thousands of attorneys out there fighting the same battles quietly, without cameras. If my moment can shine a light on them, then it's worth every second of those handcuffs." But Donovan's rise wasn't just symbolic. It was practical. Civil rights groups began reaching out, asking him to testify before legislative committees about judicial conduct reform. Universities invited him to speak about the balance of power in courtrooms. His phone never stopped ringing, and though the attention was overwhelming, he never let go of his role as a defense attorney first. Late one evening, after a long day of interviews, Donovan sat at his dining table with his daughter, a stack of legal briefs spread out in front of him. She asked quietly, "Dad, are you scared?" He paused, looking at her with tired eyes, then said softly, "Every day." But courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing anyway. Those words, overheard by a journalist who later shared them in a profile, added another layer to his growing image. Donovan wasn't untouchable or arrogant. He was human, carrying the weight but refusing to crumble. By the end of the week, his story wasn't just about one arrest. It was about the fight for dignity in courtrooms everywhere. Donovan Price had become the reluctant but undeniable face of resilience, the kind of figure who reminded the country that one person standing firm could rattle even the most entrenched power. But as Donovan's influence rose, the question remained, what would be the lasting lesson from this clash between courage and authority? By the end of that chaotic week, the story of Donovan Price and Judge Clifford Brenning had grown into something far bigger than a courthouse scandal. It wasn't just about a single lawyer in Toledo or a single judge clinging to power. It had become a mirror, one held up to the justice system, forcing people across the country to confront what it meant when the balance of power tilted too far in one direction. The Ohio Judicial Conduct Commission moved swiftly. Within days, they announced a formal suspension of Judge Brenning pending investigation. That announcement alone sent shockwaves through the legal community. A sitting judge, suspended in the wake of public outrage, rarely did accountability arrive so quickly, and yet, for many, it felt overdue. Donovan's reaction was measured. At a press conference outside his office with microphones thrust toward him, a reporter asked, "Mr. Price, how do you feel about Judge Brenning's suspension?" Donovan clasped his hands together, pausing before he answered. This was never about vengeance. It's about accountability. What happened in that courtroom isn't just about me. It's about every defendant who fears their voice will be silenced. A suspension is a start, but the real work is making sure this never happens again. His words drew applause from the crowd gathered on the sidewalk. People didn't just hear a lawyer. They heard a leader speaking to something much deeper than one legal battle. In homes across America, the story had sparked difficult conversations. Families at dinner tables debated the meaning of fairness. Students argued in classrooms about the balance between order and justice. Even retired judges appeared on talk shows, some admitting, "We've all seen colleagues who let pride override principle." The system needs reform. But while the headlines fixated on Brenning's downfall, what resonated most with people was Donovan's composure. He had been humiliated in handcuffs, yet he carried himself with dignity. He never shouted, never lashed out, never allowed anger to eclipse the truth. That image, a black attorney standing tall while dragged out of court, became etched into public memory as a symbol of resilience. At home, away from the cameras, Donovan reflected with his daughter. She asked him again if it had been worth it, risking his reputation, his career, even his safety. Donovan leaned back, his eyes tired but steady. Every time someone speaks out, it gives the next person courage to do the same. If I stayed quiet, nothing changes. And if nothing changes, then all those years of law school, all those late nights in this office, mean nothing. She didn't respond with words. She just nodded slowly, understanding in a way that only a child of a fighter could. The life lesson here wasn't buried. It was plain for anyone willing to see it. Power unchecked is dangerous, and silence only feeds it. When authority abuses its role, it counts on fear to keep others quiet. Donovan broke that expectation. And in doing so, he reminded the country that courage often looks like speaking calmly when every force around you demands silence. And Judge Brenning, his name may linger in headlines for a while, but history tends to remember not the men who abused power, but the ones who exposed it. For anyone watching this story unfold, the takeaway is clear. Injustice doesn't always wear a mask. It sometimes sits in plain sight, dressed in robes, holding a gavel. And when it does, it takes ordinary people with extraordinary courage to stand up and say, enough. So the next time you see something wrong, whether in a courtroom, a classroom, or your own neighborhood, remember this. Silence protects the abuser, but truth exposes him. Donovan Price's calm defiance proved that. This is more than just a courtroom story. It's a reminder of what it means to hold on to principle even when it costs you. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the kind of courage we need more of today, don't just walk away from it. Share it. Talk about it. And if you want more stories that confront power and reveal resilience in the face of injustice, make sure you subscribe. There are more truths to tell, and we'll be here to tell them.